What do you do, and at what level do you do it at?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, thank you for having me, first and foremost. I'll try to, I guess, keep this history brief, but basically, my name's Emily Dow. I'm currently finishing my PhD in nutrition and exercise science. Um, so I have definitely a long background in nutrition specifically. And my research is primarily focused on the microbiome gut-brain axis and how it may respond to exercise.
What's the catalyst for that peak in the gut microbiome specifically?
I think for me, what sort of, I guess, catalyzed that interest was when I was finishing my master's. I actually took a course. This program was in nutrition and human performance. So this was kind of an unusual course to even be offered, but it was on the gut microbiome in general. And so I kind of got to learn just a very surface level background on what we currently know about it, kind of the direction that that research is headed. And so I chose to do my master's thesis on the gut and specifically how it responds to exercise because I really didn't see any information on that out there. And I kind of assumed that there would be interactions there just based on how dynamic we see the entire body being. And I think the entire like summary of my master's thesis was just that we have very limited knowledge of this thing right now. And so that obviously kind of led me to want to continue digging deeper. And that is how I ended up even in a PhD program to begin with.
Interesting. Okay. What what about the gut microbiome that that is holding on to your obsession and curiosity?
Um, I think so. It's a very difficult topic to study because it is, despite what you'll kind of see on social media, it's not very well understood at all at this time. And there is still so much to be done. And I think to me, that's the really exciting part because I'm a very curious person, and so I don't necessarily even like reaching final conclusions or answers about things. I enjoy kind of looking deeper, and so I think the fact that there is just so much ahead of us to learn more about is really exciting to me. And it's something that we've kind of like understood exists for a very, very long time, but for some reason it's still very mysterious and obscured. And so I think for some reason that's just like my favorite thing. My brain lights up when I think about it.
I see that your specific PhD, I think you put it in your bio at one point. It could still be there or not, but you mentioned the gut brain axis, right?
Yep, exactly.
And so just my knowledge within this specific area, and just to give you a little background on me, I completed my master's of science in exercise physiology just 2 years ago now. That's no, 3 years ago now. It was 2021. Wow. Okay. So taking it back then, but my area, whenever we learned, was not anywhere near the gut health, gut microbiome space at all. So in anything like my knowledge on it's very on the surface level. And so what about? I just know that like the main premise between the gut and the brain is that there's like a bi-directional connection with it. And so from the normal person, what does that mean, and how can that be something that they can be interested in? Because yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. That's basically like if I were to phrase it in one sentence, it's like, yes, there's this bi-directional communication. Basically, what that means is that the microbes within your gut, and to kind of characterize, I guess, those microbes, we have 38 trillion, potentially more than that, organisms living in our guts. And so there are more bacterial cells than there are human cells in our body at any given point in time. So obviously that can be a very powerful force, and through a lot of different pathways. So we don't necessarily need to get into the weeds with all of those because I don't think most people would care. But through a lot of different pathways, it communicates with the brain, primarily through different pieces of the nervous system. But it does go in both directions. And so the brain can also influence the gut can influence the brain. And we're kind of coming to understand that those connections may to some extent underpin different types of illnesses, whether those be psychiatric or gastrointestinal.
I think I've seen some stuff where in some papers briefly that for some patients who have whatever either diseases or something in the psychological realm or more into the neuro like realm of stuff, people just improving their gut, like food in general, helps the brain and kind of like vice versa, correct?
100%. And it's definitely, it's something that I like to exercise caution when, especially talking about like psychiatric disorders and mental health stuff, because I think sometimes people overreach a little bit and are like, well, food is medicine, and to some extent it can be, but you can't always solve everything just by changing the diet. However, it does play a large role. And that's kind of what a lot of the early research identified to begin with to help understand this connection a little bit better. It was that we kept seeing in the research over and over again these really strong associations between people who had GI symptoms and or diagnosed conditions and people who had psychological symptoms and or psychiatric conditions. A lot of times they present alongside one another, and sometimes it's, this part is really interesting to me. I'm specifically like intrigued by dementia and like Alzheimer's disease. Um, and so a lot of the time, GI symptoms may present before the onset of cognitive symptoms. And so, yes, you're absolutely correct. A lot of the research basically suggests that if we can kind of work to improve one, it may also improve the other.
What about dementia and Alzheimer's has your interest right now?
I think, I think from a personal perspective, most people can probably relate to this. Like in your early adult life, I think most of us probably know someone, whether it be a family member or like a friend's family member, who's experiencing dementia, and just how challenging that can be for everyone involved. And I know you'll probably relate to this. Like as someone who I identify as kind of like a nerd, I care a lot about my brain. And so I think in terms of like health decline as I age, that's the thing that I care most about, is taking good care of my brain. And so I think the fact that there are a lot of preventative efforts that can be taken to at least mitigate that or delay the onset of that is really like hope inspiring to me. So I'm just very intrigued at understanding kind of the pathogenesis a little bit better, and how we could potentially support people in preventing that.
What are the tangible, actionable things that you do now that now like, hey, you know the depth and nuances of this particular field and in your own daily life? What are the biohacking actionable steps that you take to mitigate the potential of that?
I think the cool thing about this is that it's all pretty simple stuff. Things that most of us probably already know to do for other reasons, if anything. So obviously exercising in general, but also specifically resistance training plays a very big role in brain health, especially as we age. Um, and then in addition to that, obviously just kind of taking care of the diet, not necessarily being perfect 100% of the time, but we'll probably go into some of the specifics of, I guess, what we think that looks like in a bit. But essentially just eating a diverse, nutrient dense diet, obviously. And also just exercising your mind. That's always going to be important. And it doesn't, again, have to be anything crazy, but just basically having some mental stimulation on a regular basis, which thankfully doing a PhD is particularly good at, if not to like a harmful extent.
Just constantly the catecholamines, the adrenaline is just revved all the way up on a 10.
Yeah, it's pretty much like nonstop stressful thinking. So it's working
It's
well.
it's like the from the Batman movie where Bane goes, "You merely adopted the dark, but I was born in it." That's kind of where basically you're like molding in it right now.
Pretty much that's how I feel. And especially because I think like most, this is not shade at anyone, but I'm a little bit young for like a PhD program too. So I feel like I have a head start on that specific type of suffering. And I'm just, honestly, I plan on continuing doing this type of thing forever. But yeah, I feel like I'm being raised in that type of stressful environment.
When you say that you are going to do this forever, because I know that you are a coach as well on the like the online space, are you wanting to, of course this is probably forecasting quite far, um, but I don't know if you're already thinking about it, but are you trying to kind of walk both worlds of the application world industry and then the academic trenches as well?
More than likely, walking both worlds, yes. I don't think I ever want to stop working with people because I feel like that, A, it kind of brings you back to earth a little bit. I think in academia, we sometimes tend to forget some of the basic principles of like working with humans and what is really important when working with humans. And so I feel like working with people makes me better at science, and being better at science makes me better at working with people. So I feel like they complement one another really well. But I think like doing research is my ultimate passion, and then applying that by working with humans is kind of a subcategory that I don't think you get to do in most academic settings. So yes, I definitely plan to continue doing that as well.
Have you always been just a very curious person?
I would say so. And also just maybe a little bit obsessive about certain things. I think more than anything, I've really always loved school, and that I think sounds crazy to a lot of people because a lot of folks, I think, even if they love learning, like the academic setting is not always the most fun. I've just always loved being in an academic setting. And so that is part of it for me, is that I just tend to like learn well in that type of environment. But yeah, I find myself, I'm a very skeptical person. So I think I tend to like question a lot of things. And I think research and science tends to like provides enough of an answer and also enough of a non-answer to kind of keep me going and keep me stimulated and thinking, I guess, to some extent.
I'm sure with that skepticism, insight that you have, and just from the tangible advice that you gave earlier of like, hey, this is for my brain health. Um, I noticed that you didn't mention any supplements, any wild biohacking tactics that's just going to illuminate all of us. It's really the essential things that most of us, we are not doing enough. And if we do them enough for a long enough time horizon, it's the compound interest effect is going to take into effect. So with that skepticism, what are some things that you kind of see online that like triggers you?
Ooh, um, a lot of things, obviously, but I mean, yeah, first, I think to speak to like the supplements thing, I mean, there are always things that you can include, and there are definitely like well studied supplements that, you know, may be beneficial in a lot of cases even, but the thing is like most people would really benefit most from focusing on those basic habits, and most people would prefer to jump to things like supplements because it's a little bit easier to kind of purchase something and to just start taking it and to see what happens, and that's fine too, but those are like much smaller advantages that those are giving you as opposed to making sure that you're exercising and eating well and sleeping enough and kind of the basic things. So I guess I think what kind of drives me up a wall the most is the reckless recommendations that I see for, I mean, different supplement protocols, but specifically like the fear mongering around what you could potentially be like doing to yourself if you're not perfectly managing all of these things. Um, that's probably what makes me the most angry because I see that firsthand. Like in the people that I work with, in people that I just communicate with on the online space, a lot of the questions that I get are directed towards like, do I need to be worried about this? Like, I'm terrified because I saw this thing and now I'm worried about eating fruit or something super bizarre like that. And it just does not actually help anybody. And I feel like the people who are putting out those messages have to know that. And I just don't really understand how you could do that, like with any sense of integrity.
I I'm with you on that one. And I've had constant conversation with friends and even myself of like, okay, when it comes to nutritional information and social media as a whole, is this a net positive? Is this a net negative for people? Just because it's like, from one end of the spectrum, you can be like, hey, at least people are now aware or questioning their food choices more and what goes in their body and all the rest of it downstream. But then on the other end, there's so many. It's like at the dinner table where people tell you there's three rules: don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, and nutrition now, because it's so tribal. And if you eat with a fork, you are entitled to opinions and thoughts, and you hold so many people hold so strongly to some of those things.
Yeah.
And just zooming back out, I'm like, I really cannot answer if social media has helped nutrition information as a net positive or negative, because I don't know. I can't tell by that.
I know. And I have a hard time with that too, because I feel like it's easy to blame social media, and I definitely like to do that sometimes in my own mind. But at the same time, like misinformation has existed forever. And it's actually really fun to kind of go back and to look at some of the historical misinformation that has been put out there, especially when it's not even like knowingly misinformation at the time, but like some of the things that science believed early on before we understood things better were completely out of control in some senses. And so people have been getting bad information forever. I feel like the landscape has changed and the reach has changed. Um, and I do think that there are a lot of bad actors who take advantage of that for personal benefit. But I mean, I do think that there is a lot that we can also do as consumers, and it's not necessarily to put the responsibility on the consumers, but to just kind of navigate that landscape knowing that there are bad actors and having discretion in the way that we kind of blindly believe certain things just because someone says it with confidence. And I think it's just important to, as a consumer, question the things that you're seeing on the internet, because I'm sure everyone has experienced to some extent being lied to by somebody on the internet. And I think if we can keep that in mind, that's usually going to be good for us.
And with that, how do you define a healthy gut?
So that that is honestly a difficult thing to do, honestly, because people will I guess try to define a healthy gut, and I'll tell you from what we understand right now. Diverse is one of the first words that comes to mind. Robust is probably another one, because the thing is, I think this gets completely missed by people who are communicating about the gut on the internet. Your gut microbiome develops almost entirely by the age of 3 years old. Most of what is responsible for that development is transmission from mother to child during the peripartum period, so pre birth, during, and after birth. After the age of 3 years old, your gut resembles what it's going to look like in adulthood, and it's relatively stable aside from like more major perturbations. So things like antibiotic use can influence the gut, things like that. But people, I guess, acting like you're going to be damaging it through all these different little lifestyle things, that's just not really how it works. It's a little bit more robust than that. But generally speaking, you want a diverse population of microbes. Like certain types of strains are overpopulated or are not present in enough of an abundance. That causes problems for people. That's kind of the extent to what we know at this time, honestly, because everybody's gut appears to be very individual. It's been referred to a lot in the literature as like a fingerprint almost, where we can't necessarily characterize consistently what a healthy gut should look like. What a healthy gut looks like for you might be very different from what it looks like for me. And that is a very important thing to consider when it comes to like making recommendations.
I know some of the common symptoms that people will bring up is like, say, you are excessively bloating, like bloated, and just some of those different GI stresses and symptoms that people feel. How much of that would you say could be fall in the category of like a, in the gut health, good not? Is it just normal abdominal like abstending just from eating your food? How much bloating is normal bloating? That's a big gray area.
Yeah, and bloating is a little bit difficult to describe as well because I think people define it a little bit differently for themselves. Being somewhat full and potentially even experiencing some distension after meals is normal to some extent. I think it matters to think about when it's uncomfortable and when it's not tolerable, because I talk about this with clients a lot actually. Like people will kind of understandably panic if they're experiencing like more gas than usual, more of that type of bloating, which isn't inherently a negative thing either, because one of the most beneficial effects of, say, consuming enough fiber, which we talk a lot about, is that some of those fibers are fermentable by the microbes within your gut. And that fermentation process is beneficial. It's a good thing. And that also tends to produce gas as a byproduct. And so it's not necessarily even a problem unless it's a problem, unless it's really uncomfortable, unless it is impacting your life in a negative way. And that is when it makes sense to look further. But it's also just not necessarily as simple as I'm going to do a gut microbiome test and that's going to give me all the answers. Those can potentially be useful in certain contexts. I don't want to just like throw them to the wayside altogether. But there's a lot of pathologies that can go on in the GI tract that have nothing, they may have something to do with the gut microbiome, but there's more to the story than that as well. And I think that probably your best bet if you're experiencing really bad symptoms is probably to see a gastroenterologist first.
How validated and efficacious are the GI
So
mapping?
the tests themselves are not bad. At this point in time, and I can't speak for all of them, but they are to some extent used in a research setting. Most of what we use in the literature is DNA sequencing. It gets a little bit more complicated, but like the fecal sampling is what we use to basically characterize the gut. The biggest problem that I see is the interpretation of those results, because characterizing your gut is one thing and it can be helpful information. But many of the companies who actually produce the tests themselves set their own reference ranges, and those reference ranges aren't actually based on any science. They are more so based on what they observe as normal within their own like testing databases or whatnot. So it really requires like a very informed practitioner to interpret those results in a way that's not potentially like overzealous. It would be easy to see those results, and this is something that I kind of learned to some extent in my master's program too. And they look scary almost 100% of the time. It's very, very rare to see a GI map that just looks good. It looks flawless. So it really requires someone who's well trained at interpreting them to be able to actually put together the picture of what could be going on to potentially offer some kind of solution.
Who is qualified to interpret those type of results? Because I know that in the industry, there's a lot of people walking between lines, and it gets very messy,
Yeah.
even to me.
And that's kind of hard to say because there aren't necessarily, I don't know if there are like licensure requirements specifically for like those types of assessments. I know technically registered dietitians to some extent are able to order them for patients. It just honestly, it's more about their experience and their training and how familiar they are with that body of literature, which is hard to just identify when you're considering working with someone. So I think the best way to kind of scope it out, if you're a person who's like looking for assistance with this, is by talking to them to some extent and kind of listening to how they talk about it. Is it something where they're like fishing for specific things and they're just going to offer you supplements, and their protocols are very much based on either like restriction of the diet, which isn't usually necessary, or some sort of advanced supplement protocol, because that is usually a red flag to me. Um, I've worked with a practitioner in the past, actually Kira, who you know, she works with me at Phoenix within our coaching as well. She did a GI map for me because she is very well versed in interpreting them. I was dealing with some GI issues that I thought she could help with, and she did, because she's able to look at those results and to not just pick apart every single little thing, but again, to kind of understand the comprehensive picture, how this particular result may be impacting the other results, and what it actually makes sense to target, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. Okay. So for people listening who are Gen Pop, looking, if they are interested in looking deeper into their gut health, what's going on from a pathological perspective, red flags to look out for people is if their immediate response to you is, hey, here's some type of aggressive supplemental protocol, and here's the receipt, or here's the invoice for it if you
Yeah.
want to buy it through us, and or directing you towards others. Those are huge, big red flags that people can look out for. And green flags is someone who takes more of a holistic approach, being like, yo, let's kind of talk about this, and let's maybe take more of an actionable step of like, okay, maybe sleep more, add more fiber to your diet, etc., of just the simple basic things that you basically suggested earlier for like brain
Yeah,
health.
and I will also add to that, like a lot of the time, gut map testing is not necessary. Like that isn't even a necessary step for most cases. A lot of very well-trained practitioners, and I'm not technically like a clinician in this field of nutrition yet, um, but a lot of like well-informed practitioners can work with you and can help you see a lot of relief without testing at all. And so if they're not like offering that as a potential option, because these tests are expensive, and so as the practitioner, it's in their best interest to force you to do this testing. But a lot of the time, it kind of just it provides additional context, and it kind of validates what the practitioner is likely already thinking based on your symptoms, based on what else they're seeing. And it shouldn't necessarily be the first thing that they jump to. If that is the first thing that someone jumps to, that to me is a big red flag.
What are your thoughts around pre, post, and
So
probiotics?
yeah, this is kind of a complex topic too. I guess I'll quickly, like provide a brief definition of each. So the probiotics are kind of like those are the strains themselves. So those are living bacteria, live cultures. If we're talking about like a particular strain in the gut, we're talking about a probiotic. Prebiotics are essentially what those consume. And so fiber, for example, is a type of prebiotic. Whereas postbiotics are the byproducts of those bacteria. So short chain fatty acids are one example of those, acetate, butyrate, propionate, etc. Um, so probiotic supplementation, I think it's been expedited a little bit more than I would like, because it's not something that I will ever say no one will ever benefit from. That is not an evidence-based take. There is research to support that some people can benefit from probiotics under certain circumstances. The issue is that, like I kind of alluded to earlier, our guts are like fingerprints, and we also don't know what that composition looks like unless we were to test, which again, there's issues with interpreting them. But for example, if I were to take a prebiotic or even a combination pre, post, and probiotic, I just confused myself. If I were taking a combination of the three or a probiotic, I would be ingesting living cultures of bacteria without knowing what I need, without knowing what my gut looks like. And so it's possible, like, for example, I did a GI map. I saw on that GI map that I, if anything, had a slight overabundance of some of the strains that are in most probiotics. So if I had been taking a probiotic, that could have potentially exacerbated my symptoms and it only made them worse. And that is kind of the issue with broadly recommending that people take them, is that we don't know if those people would benefit from or potentially even be harmed by those additional strains. And at the same time, they don't appear to be very effective at actually colonizing the gut. Most of the time, we can detect those strains as you are taking the probiotic, but once you stop, they're gone. So it's something where if you were benefiting from taking it, you would theoretically have to be taking it for a long time, and also doing behaviors that promote the like support, the ongoing support of the strains that you want to be present.
Okay, yeah, because like you said at the beginning, just to make sure that I understand this right and everyone else too. So big three different ones: pre, post, and pro. So pre is the bacterias before they're consuming,
Pre
right?
is
They're
essentially like the
consuming
food for the bacteria.
the food for the bacteria. Yes, the food for the bacteria. The pro are the live cultures, and then the post is the byproduct of the
Exactly.
whole equation. And from what you're saying, that so if anyone were to take any type of biotic, you're introducing all of those live cultures in, and there might be a acute effect, but once you stop doing the thing, it's going to go away, and it's like you're back to square one. And so if you're going to hop on it, make sure you stay on it, but you don't know if you even need to hop on it because you don't know if the system is okay or not. And so you're just about to throw some fire into it, and it can mess up the whole system if you don't even know if you
Yes,
need
and
it.
it's something I don't want to fearmonger about probiotics now either. Um, I think it is unlikely that it will harm most people. I think it's also at the same time essentially throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. It's kind of just it's guesswork to take these things. And there is emerging evidence, supporting specific strains for specific conditions, for specific symptom profiles, but those are not far enough to make broad recommendations about at this time. Um, and so it's something that I think we'll have a lot more insight to soon. And I think the probiotic space is definitely worth keeping an eye on because I do think it can provide people a lot of relief in the future. But at this point, it's just too early for like me, for example, to comfortably recommend them to everyone. Now, some people will start taking one. And I think, like I said, I think in most cases they're going to be benign and potentially a neutral to positive benefit for people. But it's just important to pay attention to how they make you feel. Like if you notice like a genuine, tangible difference, it might be worth it to you. But if you don't, I don't think it's worth it either. So it's one of those things where it's definitely not on the top of my list when it comes to like supplements I would recommend.
And these products are not cheap by any means either. Because I remember the first time I was introduced to them was because I come from like training background wise. I originated from like the CrossFit space, and I remember me being like deep into it, being like, I'm gonna make it to games. I'm gonna train so hard, double sessions. Like I'm gonna get so just ripped and jacked. And I remember there was a company called Puri, and it was like from overseas, Icelandic or whatever, and they were the first introduction to the probiotics. And I remember looking at those things, and I think it was like around $50, $60 for a month. And me being a college freshman, I was like, that's a hefty chunk of my $8 an hour
Yeah.
salary back then. And now I'm sure it's only going up. And like a simpler step could probably just be like what you said earlier, it's just improving the food quality and the diversity of your food intake of what we do know now. It's just the evidence on that mountain is a lot higher. So like do that. And then like you said, it's not going to there's not like going to be a big negative. It could be only like a benign acute change, but do the big things first. And then if you want to add in the little sprinkle of if you have the extra funds to do it, doesn't hurt. But if anything, you'll be burning your wallet a little bit more by
Yeah,
choosing this
and
option.
that's kind of my take on supplements in general. I'm definitely not anti-supplement. I think they're fun, like I think they're interesting. I like looking into the research on them. I try and experiment myself with a whole bunch of stuff before it's even like fully evidence-based. So, if that's you and you enjoy like kind of delving into that a little bit, then that's fine. It's just important to be conscious of the fact that yes, it is financially expensive for potentially very marginal benefits. And as most people are aware of, the supplement industry is very poorly regulated. And so it's also a little bit sketchy to me to take most products. If you're kind of looking into the company and you are aware of their testing procedures, if they undergo, third party testing, other certifications, that's a good sign. But those products will be more expensive. That's kind of just the reality of the situation. And so if you're buying something off a shelf at Walmart, I'm not judging you for that, but it's probably like just not worth your money in that case. You're probably better off spending that on something more food related, if I had to kind of just make a general recommendation there.
This is definitely where quality matters a lot when it comes to what you're getting, because oftentimes you'll want to get the best deal. Like many of us have Costco or Sam's Club memberships, and we see all of those giant like supplement section by the checkout line, and you're like, dude, I can get some vitamin C for like 10 cents a pop, or CoQ10 or whatever else for like a fraction of anything. Load me up, inject it intravenously.
Yeah,
Let's
and
go.
and some of the
But
Costco ones are great, by the way. Like some of them are third party tested, they're high quality. Um, and I guess it's important to say you can't necessarily base the quality of a supplement off the cost. You know that obviously too, but um, it's really based on the ingredients. Like certain ingredients will just be cheaper, and especially if it's just one nutrient. So like a vitamin C is probably going to be inexpensive, even the highest of quality, but probiotics are probably going to be expensive at
Mhm.
the highest tier of quality. So it does also kind of depend, I guess, on the product itself.
So what is your PhD direction right now? Like what are you kind of diving into weeds in?
So I mean, my dissertation topic is a little bit complex because it involves a few different things. Um, but I guess the primary premise of what I'm currently looking at is the influence of resistance training specifically, because that's very underrepresented in this body of literature, on the gut brain axis, but kind of in a different way than we've been talking about today. I'm not so much interested in characterizing the gut microbiome because it is so highly variable, and because it's difficult to contextualize any of those results right now. It's hard to say, like, is this change good? Is this change bad? Because we don't know enough. I'm actually looking at intestinal permeability, which is a little bit different. It's not leaky gut per se, but it's essentially kind of looking at the way that your gut interacts with your body, because essentially things have to translocate across that barrier, and or there are different signaling mechanisms within the gut barrier itself. So that's getting a little bit nerdy, but I'm looking at how the integrity of the gut barrier changes in response to exercise, and how that may or may not be related to cognitive changes and or mood related changes. There's kind of like a second piece to that as well, though,
Mm.
because my PhD advisor, she's like the vinegar researcher. That's her baby. She's done a ton of work on vinegar, but specifically acetic acid, which is a short chain fatty acid. So it's produced by bacteria in your gut as a postbiotic. Interestingly, it's also one of the primary components of vinegar. And so there is some very limited evidence to suggest that consuming vinegar, and therefore consuming that short chain fatty acid as opposed to producing it yourself, may have similar advantages when it comes to mental health, when it comes to cognition, and also when it comes to the gut barrier. So we're having people resistance train, we're seeing how that impacts things, and then we're also adding vinegar to half of those people to see how that may impact things further.
Vinegar before, during, or
Timing
post?
in this particular study is not our main priority. It's any time of day. They are just essentially going to be diluting a couple tablespoons of it in a cup of water, drinking that on a daily basis. That's what my advisor has done work with similar like dosing strategies, um, and has demonstrated that specifically depression has improved for people. So we're kind of sticking with that protocol to see if it provides any additive benefit to the training. And then hopefully to expand upon that down the road, depending on what we see, I would like to continue diving into why that may be happening, because if we see those kinds of results, it would definitely be very interesting.
Mm. Interesting. You brought up leaky gut earlier, and that's perfect. What what is leaky
So
gut?
essentially, leaky gut is like the unprofessional term for increased intestinal permeability. That's obviously a mouthful, so I kind of get why people have termed it leaky gut. Um, but essentially, this barrier separates the basically the entire ecosystem of different types of microscopic organisms, not just bacteria, but we have like fungi, we have yeast, we have all sorts of things in our gut. So this barrier separates that from us, and it regulates mostly, I mean, a lot of things, but our immune system is one of the main components. So that barrier is responsible for basically mounting an immune response if any pathogenic organisms are going on in there. And it's also responsible for not mounting an immune response if we have commensal or beneficial organisms going on in there. So it's basically responsible for characterizing and identifying what's allowed and what's not allowed. That barrier can become more permeable under various conditions. Now, it also changes its permeability, like as just a part of regular, healthy daily living. It kind of fluxes, but we see specifically increased permeability immediately after exercise, which is not a concerning thing. That's kind of just part of that response, that stress response. But we also see chronic changes in intestinal permeability alongside a lot of different pathogenic states. So things like GI conditions, mental health conditions, and interestingly, things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease as well. I could get in the weeds as to why, but it's
Okay.
going to get a little bit geeky real fast.
Okay. And so leaky gut is something that people
Most
should not be
often,
worried
no.
about.
It's something, what I care about is keeping that barrier intact is worth prioritizing, but it's not something that you have to have at the forefront of your mind, because if you're already engaging in healthy behaviors, that is going to be promoting this. I'm just curious in exploring the role that that may play in other things.
Interesting. Very cool. Well, Emily, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for doing the podcast with me, and for it being your second one,
Thank
you
you.
did
That
fantastic.
makes me feel good. But I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, and yes, and because people need more of you in the industry. Because I came across one of your posts. I think it was I had to say if I looked it up earlier. It was one of the posts that I saw because I follow Emily Duncan, your guys' boss. And she shared your post, and I remember seeing it. I saved it, and I was like, I'm gonna reference this back in the future. This is fantastic. And it was a post where you uploaded saying 10 things that we should have been taught when we were in school, and just the depth, the nuance, and the spectrum of it was fantastic. And so when I saw you, I was like, yep, she's on my radar. And so just want to say your work is awesome. Cool. Where can people find you? Where can people just keep up with all
Yeah,
the
so I
things?
think the best place to find me is probably Instagram. I'm not really like on a bunch of platforms at this time, although I probably should be. But my handle is nutritional.gangster. Um, that may change in the future. I think I'm planning on rebranding a little bit once I have my PhD so that it's a little more professional.
It's a dope name. It's a
Yeah,
dope
it actually
name.
started as a joke because my husband and I like the whole
Dr.
spiritual
G.
gangster thing is kind of like cheesy to me a little bit. And so it was kind of a joke at first. I was just going to start a nutrition account and I was like, nutritional gangster, it's not taken. We're just going to do it. And I mean, people seem to like it. I judge it myself in the back of my head, but we'll see. Maybe I'll keep it because I feel like people know me that way now.
It shows that you have a human humor side too. Because just be a gangster.
I
That's
guess that's
it.
true. I think it kind of started because I'm not offensive, but I don't necessarily like, I guess, hold back in some of my content. And so that's kind of, I guess, the vibe that it was meant to give. But thank you for validating the username because I am self-conscious about it sometimes.
Yes. All right, guys, we're going to round this out.
Thank you
Emily,
so
thank
much.
you.